In this chapter, chapter 4, what we're trying to get at is this idea that now that we've created a discussion of demand and supply, where we had a free market that was trying to find equilibrium, that sometimes the government gets involved. For equity reasons or for social reasons, the government gets involved. And the idea here is that it's not that economists don't want equity or things like that. Our only discussion is that that removes efficiency. And that's really what we're kind of trying to say here. The theme for this chapter is generally one of government involvement creates inefficiency. And the idea might be that as a person, you might not mind that because the results are more equitable. Whereas for other kinds of people, it doesn't really matter that much that there's equity. It's that things are less efficient. And you can kind of see where that kind of can kind of split up across in the kind of the political lines in terms of whether you want a big government or a small government. That kind of is almost dependent upon whether you care about the inefficiencies existing or not. So as we talk about this, then we need to talk about this idea of the consumer and producer surplus. And then we're going to talk about what happens when the government makes the price be a certain price. Okay. I just want to make sure I have the full screen here. I'm skipping over these things here, just in the interest of time here. This is an important chapter, if only because we do encounter price controls actually pretty often. The government does get involved in setting prices, and the one that we probably all would have experienced, at least at some point in our life, would have been the minimum wage, right? Which varies by state. What is it in? Right in, I think it's like specifically in like Portland, Oregon, and in Seattle, it's actually pretty high. And in parts of California, it's pretty high. The city of New York City, it's pretty high. But federally, it's set at $7.25 an hour, meaning that regardless of what the free market would have said the price for workers should be, that essentially we have guaranteed that the price that can be paid for workers can be no less than $7.25 an hour. So that obviously has consequences for the market, something that we can kind of talk about in this chapter. To be able to start to talk about what those consequences are, we need to talk about what consumer surplus is and producer surplus is. The idea of consumer surplus is feeling like I got a good deal. I don't know how often any of you buy stuff on eBay, but I love buying stuff on eBay. And I love buying stuff on eBay because it's actually the one time it's the one place where I can buy things and feel this feeling of consumer surplus. That there's a difference between the price, like where the bids are, versus what I would actually have been willing to pay. Right? So a certain item can come up and I could say, like, if you've never used eBay, what you do is you put in what your maximum bid amount is. And then it's not that you actually have to pay that price, rather it's that the bids keep going up and up and up until and you keep bidding more and more until it reaches your maximum price. So let's say, I don't know, what I would buy on eBay. I was like, what's the last thing I bought on eBay? Oh, I bought a suitcase. I bought a new suitcase. And I was willing to pay up to $100. but I actually only paid $30 for it. There's a difference then between the price I actually paid and the price I was willing to pay. That's a $70 difference, right? I actually paid $30. I was willing to pay $100. I felt like I got a good deal. There's my consumer surplus. The way we see that graphically is that here's my demand curve. It turns out that the price I paid was $30. But that I actually would have been willing to pay $100. And so there's a difference right here of 70. And in fact, if we add this up for all the consumers, there's one person who is willing to pay 30 and actually paid 30. But there's a whole triangle here of consumer surplus, of the differences between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually paid. They all paid $30, but they all valued it at higher amounts than that. What about the person that valued it at 10? Well, that person actually didn't buy the product because they only valued it at 10 and the price was 30. So they would have been like, oh my God, I'm not going to pay $30 for a piece of luggage. I'm only willing to pay 10. But there is the last person who gets the product was willing to pay 30 and they paid exactly 30, meaning that that last customer didn't get any consumer surplus. All the remaining ones did have a difference between the price they were willing to pay, which is the price on the demand curve, and the price they actually paid. Producer surplus looks at it from the other perspective of the firm. And here, the idea is that on eBay, typically a seller gets to set the initial bid. And they're basically saying this is the minimum price I'm willing to sell it for. So in the case of this suitcase, the minimum bid was $25. So they're essentially saying I'm willing to accept as little as $25 for this item. Anything more than that I make, that's a surplus for me. And there's our idea, right? Is that then you would have a producer surplus, which would be the area above the supply curve, the minimum price they were willing to accept, versus the price they actually received. And there's my producer surplus. And that's what we get when we put this together here, right? When we're at equilibrium then, I have a consumer surplus triangle, and I have a producer surplus triangle. And what we see then, as our checkpoint here, is that when I'm at that equilibrium price, then I'm maximizing both my consumer surplus and producer surplus. Producers feeling like they're getting a good deal, consumers feeling like they're getting a good deal. One short little note I could make here would be that producer surplus is not the same thing as profit. I have no idea if that seller of the luggage made a profit for selling it for 30 rather than 25. I don't know, maybe they were trying to get rid of it and we're willing to sell it at below cost. Who knows? Producer surplus is not the same as profit. Because for profit you need costs. For producer surplus, all I need is a willingness to sell it for that price. And like I said, what if the person was desperate and they just tried to raise cash? Then they might have been willing to sell it for a price cheaper than what it actually costs for them. Now, what we see then in these typical markets is that we see then possibilities for gains for trade, or the total surplus that exists when we reach the equilibrium. In other words, when we're at the equilibrium here of demand and supply here, is that we have a total surplus of the whole triangle the summation of the consumer surplus and producer surplus. The whole question now of what we're going to be looking at in the next few slides is what happens to that surplus when we're not at the equilibrium. Right? We're not going to get as much surplus as we once had. What is the measure of that loss? That's going to be called the deadweight loss. That's going to mean that we're basically not going to have as much consumer and producer surplus as we used to have. Deadweight losses come from the reduced production. It's the way that I can represent losses in consumer surplus and producer surplus. What we see here is that, well, let's look at it this way here. Let me try to redraw this out. This picture looks pretty bad, in my opinion. What if I set the price right here? Right, and I set it above the equilibrium level. Then what's my consumer surplus? My consumer surplus is right here. Right? The area below the demand curve to the price. What about my producer surplus? That would be the area above the supply curve to the price. Area above the supply curve to the price. But now what about this triangle right here? That's my deadweight loss, DWL. That's my deadweight loss. That's a loss in consumer and producer surplus that no one else got. Right? I mean, look at what happened if we had been at the equilibrium. Look at this square right here. That square is the that square right there was producer surplus. Producers still got it, but they also got this square right here. That used to belong to consumers. Right? So both of these, right, contribute to this idea let's label these A, B, C, D, and E. A. Area A, this kind of square right here, was lost by consumers and given to producers. Area D was lost by consumers. And that's it. Area D, the upper part of this triangle, was lost by consumers, but producers didn't get it back. B, producers had it before, they just simply got to keep it. Same with C. But E was lost by producers. That's the lower part of this triangle right here. Lost by consumers and not captured by anyone else. The summation of D and E is my deadweight loss. And you can see that here as well, that when the price is placed below the equilibrium level, that here is now my producer surplus. Here's my consumer surplus. And here's my deadweight loss. That triangle right there. Same discussion as before, just flipped for the fact that I'm now below the equilibrium level. That discussion is useful because it then allows us to talk about what happens when markets fail. Markets fail for lots of different reasons. Markets can fail because there's a lack of competition, meaning that the supply curve is controlled by a single firm. It may fail because not everyone knows about the prices for the product or the price they can get for the product. It can happen because there are external benefits or costs. These are what we would call externalities. And markets can also fail because sometimes the resources are owned by the public, and the product is then produced by the public. And so what that tells us is that why are markets such a good thing for economists? Because a free market has no deadweight loss. You get deadweight losses when we're not allowed to get to the equilibrium, when something stops us from getting to the equilibrium. And that what we can then see is that where would we need to get involved in the market? When is government intervention justified? When we have these market failures, when there are externalities, when we have inadequate information being addressed, when we don't have enough competition, when there are public goods. These are areas where then government intervention is justified. So let's talk about how this can exist then. This can exist in terms of market controls, can exist in one of two ways. Either I can have a price ceiling, and in the case of a price ceiling, what I'm doing there is I'm setting the maximum price. So it's like the ceiling in a house, right? You can only go so high. The idea with a price ceiling, now this is where it's going to seem a little odd, but let me try to explain, even though visually it looks odd, why it's not wrong. Let's talk about gasoline, because we all probably pretty much know the price per gallon. I go to Costco, so it's going to be a little bit different here if you don't, but I paid $2.19 a gallon today. Price ceilings can be placed anywhere, but there's only one meaningful place to place them. What if the government put the maximum price at $10? Would anyone care that the price ceiling was set at $10? No. This would be what's called an ineffective price ceiling. The reason why no one would care is because the law says you can charge no more than $10 a gallon for gasoline. Who cares? The price is less than that. But what if instead that law said you can charge no more than $1 for a gallon of gasoline? This would be an effective price ceiling. So effective price ceilings are placed below the equilibrium. Because if the Costco could charge me what they wanted to, they would have been charging me $2.19 a gallon. but they can't. They're not allowed by law to charge me any more than $1. It results in a shortage because now at $1, here's my quantity supplied, and it is definitely less than my quantity demanded. So even though I made gas cheaper, not enough people are going to be able to get it. And that's what we see right here. What we also see very meaningfully is that besides having a shortage, we also have a deadweight loss that exists. Another bad reason for having a price control. So it may seem great to make gasoline be really, really cheap, but it causes shortages and it causes a deadweight loss. Why should we care about this in Hawaii? Well, part of the discussion we have oftentimes in Hawaii is about housing prices and making what's called affordable housing. I am not against affordable housing. I really am not. I'm sort of need it. But as an economist, again, only as an economist as I'm saying this, there would at least be one reason why you could say it might not be a good idea to have affordable housing. And I'm not trying to be heartless when I say this. But why would you want to build an apartment complex if you could only charge a very low price for rent? You wouldn't. There'd be a shortage of places. And in fact, what kind of places would exist that charge this really low price? Landlords that don't care or have really junky places to rent out, right? And that's what's going to exist here in this kind of market. You've made the housing affordable, but there's less of it now to go around. Maybe you get reelected because you said I made it for more affordable housing, but it's going to be harder to get those kinds of really cheap places. Now, what we can also see here is that what happens with price controls is that then the problem with the shortage is that the only one who gets the gasoline then is the person who waited longer in line. I'm willing to pay $2.19 a gallon for gas, but I'm not going to get the gas because someone was going to camp out all night and get it for $1 a gallon before it ran out. That's a misallocation of resources. People who are getting the product are not the ones who value it the most. That'd be another reason why price controls hurt the economy overall. Now, as for our price floors, again, we can kind of place them anywhere, but they only make sense when you place them above. Sorry, I don't know why I wrote that. They only make sense when I place them above the equilibrium. By that I mean, let's look at again the price of gasoline. Again, a market we all know very well. Now I'm setting the minimum price. You can go no lower than the floor. What if I say that the minimum price of gasoline has to be $5 a gallon? Well, now Costco is going to get to charge me $5 a gallon for gas. Not going to like it. I'm not going to want to buy that much gas. Costco is certainly going to want to sell it. What would happen if it had been placed below it? They would say the minimum price per gallon is $1 a gallon. That would be ineffective. That would be ineffective because who cares, right? It's already higher than that, the minimum price. But under this effective price floor, now my quantity demanded is less than my quantity supplied. I now have a surplus with a price floor. And it also has a deadweight loss. Where do we see price floors? You see them quite oftentimes in agricultural products. But you also see them, this is what the minimum wage is. Now, to understand this, you have to understand this as you, as the worker, are the supplier. So there are lots of people who are willing to work at the minimum wage. There's not a lot of firms that want to hire people at the minimum wage, which means that there's a surplus of labor, or that there's unemployment that exists because of the minimum wage. Gets votes, makes politicians look good to say we raised the minimum wage, but it does increase unemployment. There are other times that the government gets involved in setting the price. This would be like, for instance, if you have a disaster, you might want to say that you can't change the price more than a certain amount, you know, for like chainsaws if there's a big windstorm, right? Because you want to be fair to people, and you don't want to, you don't want firms to gouge their customers. That's just that. It's like price controls, but they're not that disagreeable. And that's then what we see here, right? Is that my price ceiling is my maximum price to be effective or meaningful. I'd want to set it below the equilibrium, and it's going to result in a shortage, and you're going to have a deadweight loss. For a price floor, it's the minimum price to be effective. I want to set it above the equilibrium. It's going to result in a surplus and also result in a deadweight loss. Again, it can be ineffective and then be above or below, but then you're not going to get this. If it's ineffective, well, economists will be happy because you will be at the market equilibrium. There will be no effect if it's ineffective. Okay, so that's a rather short chapter, but again, it kind of highlights why economists love markets so much, because they basically, in this shorter chapter, at least we have a discussion now of why economists love markets so much and why they think government involvement in the market is so bad, because it creates these inefficiencies, the inefficiency understood as the deadweight loss.